Thank you. I've been asked to follow John Storkey, and I've been asked to follow John Storkey before, and I think it makes my job so much easier because a few of the slides I'm going to be able to just whiz over because he's covered them in far greater detail than I have. Once again, sorry, I did warn people I tend to move. You just have to wave at me if I go too far away from the microphone. Anyway, yeah, so I'm from the Allerton Project. For those of you who don't know about the Allerton Project, and from all the familiar faces, I don't think that's too many people, but we're a research and demonstration farm. We're in Leicestershire. We've got heavy clay soil and a lot of rain, and that really influences the kind of results we get on the farm and the trial experiments that we do. And we've been set up as a research and education trust as part of the GWCT, but our remit is to combine productive farming with conservation and to research the interaction between farming and wildlife and managing the environment. So more about land sharing than land sparing. And that's my role in the Allerton Project, is in the research team, driving a lot of these trials and the research, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And then the key thing that I think makes the Allerton Project really special is that we focus not only on the research, but disseminating those results out, something Paul was saying earlier, I was very pleased to hear. We have our Director of Policy in the audience. So we don't just get results, we try and make something from them. We try and make them applicable to the farmers, and we try and make them applicable to policy. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit here. Now, this is one of the slides I can skip over, very similar to one John showed. This is our version of it, but it's the same thing. Regenerative agriculture, I don't believe it needs defining. Same answer as John on that one, but there are principles that people try and follow, and here they are. And why does everyone think regenerative agriculture is the way that we should be going? Well, there's two reasons. There's soil health and there's climate change mitigation. And I think one of these is more important than the other. And I think you may all be aware by the time I finish this presentation which side of the fence I sit, but I'll leave it there for now. So soil biology. Well, part of regenerative agriculture is building the soil biology, not just building the soil biology, but building the diversity of the soil biology. And that's really important. We've got all these different organisms going on inside the soil, and without them, soil does nothing. With them, soil has functionality, and we need our soils to function in order to grow our crops, in order to feed the world. So this drive and focus on your soil health and your soil biodiversity is essential. I'm not expecting you to look at this over here. I just really love this image because of the title, A Simplified Soil Network. And it's incredibly simplified compared to what we know, the fraction that we know about that's going on in soil systems. And it's the biodiversity that's driving this complicated network. Not only that, but when people talk about biodiversity, I often find that they are thinking above ground. They're thinking at the biodiversity they can see. And in recent study in 2023 has decided that we now think there is more than half of global biodiversity is within the soil. So when we're thinking about our globe's biodiversity and how to protect it, we have to look down, because if we're not, we're missing out more than half of our biodiversity. And why is biodiversity so important? Well, if we look at our simplified network, we can see our nodes and our connecting lines. If we do something, if the weather does something and it knocks out one of those nodes, it reduces one of those nodes, we have the connectivity to compensate for that. And that's resilience. So if something happens, those interactions, those soil processes can keep going if we have a complicated enough looking mess in our soil. And that's what we're trying to strive for. And not only does biology do good things for soil functionality, it's what builds the soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is everything that was once alive and is now dead. And so if you feed that living element of the soil, you're feeding the soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is what holds the carbon in the soil. It's very good for soil for lots of reasons. But it is the reason why, when people talk about regenerative agriculture and when food supply chains are thinking about pushing their farmers towards regenerative agriculture, This element of soil carbon is sometimes why they consider it in terms of climate mitigation. Now, there are lots of different percentages of greenhouse gas emissions that we could throw here. Paul had some, I've got some. It doesn't matter what the actual numbers are. The fact is that because of these numbers, farmers are being put a lot of pressure on to reduce them. Not just to become carbon neutral, but potentially even become carbon negative, because farming is one of those few industries where we can get carbon from the atmosphere through the plants into the soil, and that ability to negate CO2 is being pushed as something we should be trying to maximize so that we can offset carbon emissions in other areas. Now, this isn't always a good thing. There are some limitations to how much soil carbon can do in terms of mitigating climate change. So having this as our main driver can sometimes cause some blinkers, which can cause problems. So firstly, there is a finite quantity. Absolutely there is. And it means that this is, even if we do everything right across all the land we have, a temporary solution, because one day the management that we use will give us our top level. It's quickly reversible. So as a long-term strategy, it depends on us setting some very strict guidelines on how land would be managed now and for the future. And when you take that flexibility out of farming, you tend to get problems, as an audience like this will really understand. And unintended consequences. Now, John Storkey called these trade-offs, and trade-offs of regenerative agriculture. And that's what I'm going to be doing quite a lot of this talk on as well. So thank you very much, John, for the introduction. In particular, I'm interested in greenhouse gas emissions, one of my favourite research areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So firstly, just to go over these in a little bit more detail, I'm not going to talk about these graphs in any detail because we are at Rothamsted and there are people in the audience who know these graphs better than me. But I think long-term experiments are so vital in showing us these trends. The one on the left there is the Broad Book experiment, where we're showing that even putting what is for most farmers an unachievable amount of farmyard manure on year after year, we reach a plateau. And on the other experiment, showing there that when you change management from arable to grassland, you do increase the soil organic matter, but again, it reaches a new stable plateau. And when you take grassland out, you can reverse that. So understanding that there is this limitation comes from really great long-term experiments like we have here. And it's quickly reversible. Now, I'm going to have to rattle through this one because I can do a whole hour on this graph alone. But basically, soil carbon is not just one thing. It comes in lots of different forms, and how it's stored depends on how easy it is to take it back out of storage. So we have at the top there our actively cycled carbon. That's the stuff you want to focus on using. That's the stuff that's quickly feeding your soil biology, giving your plants available nutrients, growing your crops. And then you have the carbon, which we would call stored. It can be stored because it's chemically stuck to your silt and clay particles. It can be stored because it's in the middle of a microaggregate and there's not enough oxygen for it to be broken down. It's physically protected there. Or it can be stored because it's not very palatable. So the microbes look at it and think, you've got a lot of difficult bonds. It's not worth my energy getting anything good out of that bit of nutrients there. Maybe the carbon to nitrogen ratio is just not right. But if you think about things like soil disturbance, you can very quickly reverse what we've called our soil stored carbon. You can break up those chemical bonds. You can break up those microaggregates. And you can change with chemistry inputs and with the change of oxygen, with the change of pH, with the change of fertilizer, you can change the biochemical composition of the soil, making bits that were at one time biochemically protected, now seemingly like an easy source of carbon for those microbes. So soil management can very easily, with small tweaks, make what we consider stored carbon reversed. And now the bulk of what I'm going to talk about is these trade-offs, these unintended consequences of regenerative agriculture. And number one, we have weeds. And don't worry, John, I'm not going to talk very much about that because I think you've covered it, but I think it's really important to remember that we have a heavy clay soil. Blackgrass is not our friend at the Allerton Project, and we've seen this in our regenerative agriculture trials. We have weather, and again, on heavy clay soils, operating windows are really key to us. And John, I think his final comment after his talk was, and then we have climate change and everything that's done. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about. And then greenhouse gas emissions, disease pressure. I'm going to leave that to the experts in the room to discuss amongst yourselves, and profitability. And I'm going to talk about all of these elements in the context of our Syngenta Conservation Agriculture Project. Now, again, we had some discussion about the different names we call things. The Syngenta project started being called the Conservation Agriculture Project, and to move with the times, I think we now call it the Regenerative Agriculture Project. But what it tries to be is we don't have 24 different treatment combinations. We have three treatments, and we try and do the kind of something that runs alongside the very detailed scientific look that John does, and we try and do a practical way of how a farmer would manage these different types of management. So we have the PL plot, that's our conventional system which allows ploughing. Then we have systems of less cultivation. We have a site at Luddington on our heavy clay soils. We have these 3 plots run across 5 different fields, so 5 different points in our rotation at all times are under these 3 treatments. And then we have a sister site in Kent, which is on lighter land, so we can compare these 3 treatments, how they work on the light soil and how they work on the heavy soil. And this is the data from the first 5 years of the projects, and we saw lots of good things. We saw birds increasing when we reduced cultivations. We saw greenhouse gases decreasing. We managed to increase the soil cover. We increased the earthworms, and we dropped our carbon footprint. So all very good things. But what I want, again, as I keep saying, to talk about is not that work, but the problems that we came across. Because having a farm that we're managing as a conventional farm, one of the benefits is we can really think about what it actually means for a farmer to try and follow these type of principles, what problems they come up against, and the unintended consequences. The first one we noticed quite rapidly was the blackgrass, and we managed to strong arm David from the weeds group here down to our site so he could single-handedly map our worst fields and help tell us quantitatively whether what we thought we were seeing was definitely happening. And yes, it was. That plot in the middle that's all in red, that was our direct drill plot. And when you take away one form of management, when you take ploughing off the table, you can run into problems because you don't allow yourself that flexibility. We are on heavy land and we can't always do delayed drilling. Sometimes we have to go in early because the weather, the soil gets too wet. We can run into these kind of problems. And then weather. Now this was a very bad year, and I'm sure many in the farming community will remember this year. It started with Storm Babette, which came about 24 hours after we'd just finished drilling. And then it didn't let up. So our fields, our soil type is a heavy clay soil, and it infiltrates about, at the most, 4 millimeters an hour. It's going to take a long time for those fields to dry out enough for us to get on the land and for us to drill the crop. And after Storm Babette, most of the things we drilled failed. And then we didn't manage to get on the land again for the rest of the autumn. But then we still didn't manage to get on the land in a lot of spring. And what we ended up with was quite a few fields that were completely bare. And that's really, really bad for soil health. You're not feeding your microbes. You're not protecting the soil with soil cover. And all that rain is having a detrimental effect on your soil structure. It's causing compaction. It's causing problems. This is an example of one of our fields that suffered from a lot of waterlogging. And what you can see is the two plots that had reduced cultivations have basically failed to grow because they're too waterlogged. Whereas on this year, where we had gone in with a plough, it had just lifted that soil slightly and allowed better infiltration. So we did actually get some emergence. And for everything we say about trying to reduce cultivation and reduce soil movement, I think most farmers would agree that they would much prefer that middle plot with something green in it than the plots that have got lovely undisturbed soil. However, if you notice the channel down the middle has gone for the looser soil. It's managed to erode that soil, whereas our direct drill plots with the kind of better soil structure, they've held together better. So this is, I love this as a great illustration of the trade-offs of regenerative farming and why the decisions are sometimes quite tricky to make. Okay. So another trade-off of regenerative farming is the greenhouse gas emissions. This is data that, well, firstly, this is not the correct way to display this data. This is not a scientific way to display this data. And I spent about 2 days trying to decide how to present this data, and decided that what I was going to do was show it to you like this and explain why this was wrong. So bear with me, but I have put no error bars on to show you that it's not scientific. So I'm covered, I think. But I can't remember which speaker said, I think it was Paul, said greenhouse gas is difficult to measure. And in my defense, yes, it really is. So what we've been doing at the Allerton Project is we've been looking at greenhouse gases, but we've been doing it with our infield gas analyzer, which you can see in the picture in the foreground, my Ghostbuster pack, as I like to call it. And we do it for 10 minutes at a time. And we do it maybe 6 times over the year. And that means that for an entire year that field is giving off greenhouse gases, we measure it for maybe an hour. So it's not very representative of what's going on, but we fully understand that. When we were looking at ways to show the data, we have now got 9 years of this data of greenhouse gas emissions that's been sporadically measured out. So there's enough to show us some interesting trends. But greenhouse gas emissions are so influenced by the disturbance of the soil, the water content, the temperature, the fertilizer applications, that it's very difficult to take all of that out, particularly when showing you a graph. So what I've done is shoved everything together and shown you the average of everything we measured over 9 years in a very unscientific way. But what it threw out to us was what we found when we've been doing far more complicated modelling using all those variables. And that's that the Loddington soil, the heavy soil, had a greater reduction in CO2 production when we went, so from left to right, we're reducing cultivation. So when we reduced cultivations, there was less CO2 produced. Whereas the Lenham, the lighter soil, we didn't have that change quite so much because I think it's very light land and it doesn't hold onto the organic matter so much, so there's less to be released. When we look, and the reason my special Ghostbuster pack is so special to me is it doesn't just measure CO2, it simultaneously measures 6 different greenhouse gases. So it can also do nitrous oxide, it can do methane, it can do ammonia. And measuring those simultaneously has given me some really interesting data over the years. On one trial where we had a compaction issue and we tried direct drilling into our compaction, and then we had other methods of alleviating that compaction. We maybe used ploughing, we used subsoiling. We found that despite when you looked at CO2 on their own, ploughing was the worst for greenhouse gas emissions. When you looked at the compacted direct drill, we had off the scale nitrous oxide production, because nitrous oxide is not produced at a nice level rate across the year as some of the other greenhouse gases are. It's produced in kind of big bursts when the conditions are right. And it's when they when the microbes are finding that they have kind of a waterlogged environment and they're out of oxygen, that's when you get the most nitrous oxide production. So compacted, direct drill soil, not much pore space, you do tend to get more nitrous oxide. But that's not what we found when we looked at the 9 years of data on Syngenta plots. But you have to remember these are time points really that I've squished together in a very unscientific graph. So when we went back and looked at the data and we were looking at where these nitrous oxide spikes were, we found that they were all in the conventional, in the plough plots, but they were also mostly in spring. So we started to thinking, why is it that we're getting most of that nitrous oxide emission coming out in the spring? And in the plough plot, I realized that we have timed our greenhouse gas emissions for interesting events. So we do it quite soon after ploughing, we do it quite soon after fertilizer application. So what we were finding is that we were getting this spike in nitrous oxide, but it wasn't continuous. It was in a few discrete cases, which was completely skewing our average. It was when we had ploughed and then put nitrogen on, and we put it at the same rate as the other plots. But that mineralization after the ploughing meant there was more nitrogen sloshing around in our plough plots, and some of that spare nitrogen was just going straight off into the environment as nitrous oxide. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think, although that's bad for climate change, that's not the reason I'm that interested in it. What I can see is an inefficiency here. I can see a problem. When we get nitrous oxide spikes, it's showing us something has gone wrong. We've perhaps put too much nitrogen on and we're wasting it. And when we're thinking about profitability, that's something that's really key in optimizing your farming system so that you don't get that kind of loss. And also when we have the opposite effect, when the direct drill plots are producing too much nitrous oxide, that's a sign that we've done something wrong there. We should maybe alleviate some compaction, because anoxic environments are very bad for the microbes, as is too much nitrogen. So once again, it's a sign of an inefficient farming system. And I think that that's how we can use these kind of greenhouse gas emissions, not thinking about climate change mitigation, but thinking about optimizing, tweaking, driving forward our soil health and driving forward our profitability and production. And with that in mind, my one last graph. This was done by the Allerton Project, so I'm not going to talk very much about it. But they looked at our 5 years and our profitability. And what we found was there was in Lenham's a nice light land, a little bit easier to make a profit maybe, but that most of the time reducing cultivations where you didn't need those cultivations on those light land was a great way of reducing your margins and increasing your profitability. Whereas in Loddington, we don't always have such an easy ride. But if you look at the average, generally reducing our cultivations made us more resilient. So even on the years where we lost money, we lost less because we were putting less into the system. But that said, the key is context. So we have to think about what different soil types need. So that's why regenerative agriculture can't have a key, very defined set of principles, because they have to be people thinking about what's right for their business and what's right for their soil type, what's right for the year they've had, what's right for the crop they're going, thinking about all sides of the Rubik's Cube, thinking about the problems that might be coming in to farming and trying to farm in a way that mixes all of that up together. It's not an easy job. So, and then the weather, as we saw in those extreme events, are becoming more and more frequent and is causing even more headaches for this kind of farming system. So farming needs flexibility, and I would, because I'm a scientist, I'm going to add in farming needs research. It needs us to think holistically, try and put all this together and help them work their way through the Rubik's Cube of different complexities.